we'll go ahead and get started. There are a few others I'm sure that will join in with us. And Laura is letting folks in, so that's a good thing. Welcome. This is the third of the third series of the training. We're glad you're back. We're welcome Shanae Daughtery and Kendall Akers today, who will be leading us in thinking about our community resources and ways that we can reach out to within our community and create those vital partnerships that we need in being able to work with children and families, as well as partnering with schools and other places that we are in ministry in the community. So Shanae and Kendall, we're looking forward to what you have to share with us today. Just FYI, give us a couple of days and all three of the training sessions will be on the conference website so that you can go back and preview and review at a later date, but also so that you will have a chance to share with others in your congregation as well. I believe Harmony Family Center, you'll be receiving a feedback evaluation form from them. And if you could take just a few moments when you receive that to fill that out and return it, it helps them, but they will be sharing that with Laura and I as well. And so that will be useful as we think about how we need to proceed into the future with further training and resources. Let us open with a word of prayer. A loving and gracious God, we thank you for this beautiful day, that we hold in our hearts and minds those who are affected by the hurricane storms in Louisiana, and who will be impacted by storms in the days ahead. Devastation and happens, and it feels like the rug has been pulled out from us. But we know that no matter what happens, you were always with us. You walk with us, and you put the people in place who can help, those helping hands and assistance that we need. And we're ever so grateful. We're grateful for this training and this experience in helping us to think through the children and families that we are in ministry with, the ways that we can respond and react in effective ways. We're grateful for community partnerships, for the partnership with Harmony Family Center, but partnerships that we can make within our own communities so that we can be the most effective and bring the best resource to our families. Undergird us, open our minds to new ideas and new possibilities. Lead us with your wisdom and guidance. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Shanae and Kendall, it's all yours.
All right, well, it's wonderful to see you all. We're going to start by just taking a moment to introduce ourselves, and then we'll jump right in. So my name is Shanae Daughtery. I am one of the family therapists at Harmony Family Center, and I work in the ASAP program. So that is Adoption Support and Preservation. So I do in-home family therapy for children who've been adopted, primarily through the foster care system. And then I also do some other therapeutic camp work as well. We run a therapeutic day camp during the summertime. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll let Kendall introduce herself, and then we will get started.
Hi, I'm Kendall Akers, and I've been with Harmony for about 6 years now, and so I've worn several different hats. I've also done some in-home work with post-adoptive families, but part of what I do is just lead training within our organization, but also outside of our organization, and also help with camps and all the different, a lot of different programs that we offer. So it's good to be with you all today.
So thank you. And one of the reasons that I am doing this training today, in addition to working at Harmony, is that I am also a youth minister in the Episcopal Church. So I'm at Good Samaritan in Knoxville, Tennessee, going on year 6 of that job. It was supposed to be a college job, and here I still am. And so I have done a lot of work to really create a trauma-informed youth group and really congregation at my church, kind of blending my two worlds. And so I'm bringing that experience to this conversation as well. So if you have specific questions, please feel free to ask. So we'll go ahead and switch to our next slide. So churches are full of all kinds of different people with all kinds of different backgrounds. And in thinking about how we create a really trauma responsive congregation, there are sort of lots of different facets that we need to consider. And over the last 2 trainings, we have talked about some different ways to do that. And today, Kendall and I are really going to try to help think about how we make a whole community and really connect people to the resources that they might need in dealing with trauma and other needs. And we'll call this the therapeutic web. So I had mentioned this quote in my first session several weeks ago now, but I think it's still an important thing to hold as we have this conversation. So Christians often try to move too quickly from trauma to resilience, from death to resurrection. This insistence leaves traumatized people feeling even more isolated. Rambo reminds readers to linger in a Holy Saturday frame of mind, bearing witness to what will never be the same. Just as the Christian liturgical year cycles through the same themes, people who have experienced trauma often need to repeat their stories. Entering into others' suffering builds the relationships that help them heal. And this is something that for me, I think is a helpful sort of frame as we have this conversation, that we don't want to move too quickly from the hard things to the happy things, but really finding ways to be with and to support people in the hard times. Which I think is a unique role that the church is kind of perfectly set up to do. And it can be really hard to know exactly what to do with all of this. It can be a little bit overwhelming to know where to start or how to connect hurting people to the resources and supports they need, or even to know when can I handle this or when do I need some extra support. And so I'm going to pass this off to Kendall, and she is going to share a little bit from her perspective too.
Thanks so much, Shanae. Yeah, I think a lot of people that you all see that are reaching out to you maybe for resources because they're struggling with their child or their children. Or maybe you are sort of overseeing different programs and there are children in those programs who are displaying different behaviors, and the people who are directly working with them maybe are struggling to know how to best support them, how to remain patient when they're helping them, when they're in classes together. So a lot of times, it is hard to feel like, gosh, I'm not equipped. I don't have all the tools. And whenever I went back to grad school to get my master's degree for marriage and family therapy, a friend who was going through the program with me, she was in ministry, and she said, I just felt like people kept coming and I wanted to be able to help them more, but I knew my limitations. And so hopefully this will give you some ideas about sort of a framework, a way to think about how to put some things in place. I know Allison talked last time about regulation tools. And so we really want to help you think through when you're referring families to resources, what are the resources that are out there and what to look for in those resources. Because it can be really challenging to know where to turn to get the help that you need. So we're going to take a moment, and I'm going to hope that this video works. This is Dr. Karen Purvis, and she created what's called trust-based relational intervention. She was out of Texas Christian University. She was actually a foster mom herself, and did a lot of research in this field of helping children from hard places. She wrote the book called The Connected Child, and she has so many good resources online, including lots and lots of videos on YouTube that you can direct parents to if they're having issues with specific behaviors like lying or food issues or things like that. But we're going to talk about, or we're going to watch her video on how to set children up for success and how to shift that interaction with children. And Shanae, if you will let me know, I may have to share a new screen here.
We want our children to have the impression that we're their coach and their advocate.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
We can hear it, but not see it.
Not see it? Okay, thanks for letting me know. Love technology. Okay, this should work.
We want our children to have the impression that we're their coach and their advocate, not their adversary. We want them to know that we're not waiting for them to fail so we can give them consequences. We want to begin to set them up to succeed and for them to be aware that we're interested in them succeeding, not in finding ways to punish them when they fail. So if a child has a situation where they frequently have a meltdown, we ask the parent to think about what happened before, what was going on, and then how can you set that child up to succeed? I think, for example, I was with a boy actually in another country, and we were taking a walk, he and his mother and I, and he got overtired. And by the time we got back to their home, he had a piece of dessert being cut for him and a piece being cut for his mother and his dad, and he perceived that his dad's piece was a shred larger than his, and he had a complete meltdown. Well, he was actually just a little overtired from the walk. So one of the things we recognized with that child was that when he got overly tired, that we were very likely to have serious behavior problems. And so I began to say to him, now, you know what, buddy, we're going to take a walk today, but yesterday when we took the walk, you didn't tell us when you started to get tired, so we need for you to listen to your body, and we'll stop and ask you every little so often, what does your body need? Are you ready to go back? And if you find that you feel grouchy, would you just use your words and say, I'm feeling grouchy, I think I need to rest, or I'm feeling grouchy, I think I need something to eat. And because we made a strategy that we developed together as partners, we were able to see that pitfall coming, and he was able to say, I'm getting tired, can we go back to the house? I'm feeling very grouchy. And we were able to work together to solve that problem. Very often, if parents will keep a journal for a week, they'll be able to tell exactly where the pitfalls are. And then they'll be able to create proactive strategies, enlist the child's help. So don't hammer them when they're failing, because if their blood sugar is low or they're overtired, you're not going to get partnership. But then wait, like I did the next day. Now, buddy, when we take the walk, remember what happened yesterday? And how about if we do this together today? And in this, the kids become our partner. In this, the kids become more self-aware. And in this, the kids become successful and joyful in their success, and parents becomes more joyful in their parenting. For many parents, being proactive has some really common denominators. when parents first say to us, I can't predict my child's behaviors, and I say we keep a journal for a week, well, pretty quickly they can recognize when my child is too hungry, when my child has had more than a couple of hours with a physical activity. So the other chemistry gets high and the stuff that we want gets low. And so a physical activity every 2 hours, something to eat every 2 hours, even hydration makes a significant difference. There's quite a bit of medical publication on cognitive aptitude when you're dehydrated. And for many of our children, a huge area for parents to be aware, to be proactive, is transitions. For all of us, we might find ourselves sitting in the car when we stop at the store or at our office to finish a song. We just need that sense of completion. Our children very often need that sense of completion too. So if we can create partnerships in transitions, in meeting the children's needs, we can avoid many pitfalls that consistently cause our children to fail.
So I'm curious, and whenever Shanae and I do a training, we are actually pretty conversational. So I'm curious to hear, and I need to end that really quickly. There we go. Okay. I'm curious to hear maybe what some things were that came to your mind as you were listening to that video of Dr. Karen Purvis talking, and maybe were you thinking about some specific situations that you faced in different programs or with different children, or maybe ways that you might implement some of the things that she mentioned to help kids and teachers feel more successful? So my mom taught a nighttime, like a Wednesday night class for the church that I grew up in. And in the past few years, she had a student there who had a history of trauma and had experienced adoption and was just really struggling still, had not been able to calm herself down. And so, my mom mentioned some of the struggles that they had. And I think that just helping normalize that, helping teachers know that, yes, those are struggles that you're often going to face, or, people in church leadership realize that is important. And yeah, I'm seeing some comments here. So thank you all for commenting there. But just being able to look at the basics of, maybe you see a pattern, maybe it's harder to see a pattern when you only see them a couple times a week, like Cassandra said. But, like she mentioned, working with the parents to maybe notice or to know about some things that may be triggering for the children, some times of day that are harder if it's related to church activities, and to just really be proactive so that they can feel successful and feel like they can be connected to others when they're at church, rather than feeling so different and so isolated and on the fringes, like they're so different from everyone. And I think too, just thinking about basics like physical needs of, having something to drink, having a snack. So we'll talk about this later in our presentation, but at camp, we set it up so that every couple of hours, our families and kids are getting a meal or a snack, just because children with a history of food malnourishment and food insecurity, they tend to be very sensitive to blood sugar changes, and so we want to make sure that they have the best chance to be successful and for their mood to be stable. All right. So as we think about engaging with kids and even other adults as we're, providing this support in the local church, this sequence of engagement can be really important and really helpful to consider, because when a person is struggling, I think, we've mentioned maybe this in previous trainings. It's not very helpful for someone to come to you when you're upset or frustrated and for them to say, well, you just need to calm down, right? Who in here feels calmer when someone says to you, calm down? That's all you need to do. So rather helping us understand and remember that it's sort of this sequence that we can't immediately go to this place of being a reasonable person or of using the top most sophisticated part of our brain when we're so upset or when we're having a physical need, right? We need to feel regulated first, and there are some things that we can do, which we'll talk more about, which could include sensory input from the outside. So some of the things that Allison talked about at the last session that you can do for kids, and to help them feel more calm in their bodies, but then also the inside world to help them feel calm. So regulating first, helping them get regulated first, and then relating to them and connecting to them, and then asking them to use that top part of their brain and be more, use that reason or use that reflection, which is often where people grow in their faith, is up in that area of the brain. So it's important to realize that it's not always going to be so easy to just quickly tell a child to calm down, and that they may need a little bit of support. So we're going to look at the 6 R's, and I think that Allison also touched on this last time, and maybe Shanae touched on it as well. At Harmony, we have fully started, taking on that concept that repetition is the best way to learn. So usually you'll hear things multiple times and you'll understand them at a deeper level each time, or something might just click, when it hasn't in the past. So some things that we're going to be looking at is how can you practically do these things in your church, do these 6 R's, and just sort of as a way of overview and summarizing what you've maybe heard before. So let's see, go ahead and go to this one. So we're going to look at some of these things. One is repetition, and how important that is to help traumatized children especially, but also people who are maybe just stressed and struggling, feel better, feel more comfortable. It's important to provide a consistent schedule and a predictable pattern to the day. And it's so fun. A lot of, some kids maybe like novelty and like things to be new and exciting and fun. And so you may want to do activities and feel drawn to activities that are new and different every time, or even changing the schedule to keep them on their toes. But it's important for people with who come from hard places or with a trauma history to provide that consistency in the schedule, a consistent pattern in sort of rituals, or in how the meetings go when you're together, the gatherings go, keeping the same rhythm for activities, maybe during regular children's classes or youth meetings, if possible. So trying to do, a starting activity, a middle activity, and then an ending activity. And as much as you can have that sort of follow a consistent rhythm. Of course, you can do different activities in each of those, but that they know what's going to happen, or even have an agenda posted. I think that we talked about that before, so that they know what's coming. They're not surprised by anything. Having consistent times for activities. So I know some churches do Wednesday night gatherings, or Sunday morning gatherings, or Sunday night gatherings. So that can be really good and regulating for kids, because then they know, what, I'm going to be at this place with these people doing these things that we always do when we're at church. And so it can help them just feel more stable throughout their week, to have something like that to look forward to that's sort of an anchor for them. And if it's difficult for a child's family to commit to those regular gatherings when they start happening again, I know we're all kind of having to pivot a little bit because of coronavirus, but when those gatherings are happening and maybe a child's family doesn't have the resources to get them there, offering and finding a way to get them transportation to those things, because kids that are on the fringes that are struggling really need that consistency in those relationships and in those times together with other people that are positive and investing in them. Try to, if you can, reduce a lot of extra free time during the time that you all are together, because that can feel like a little bit too chaotic, or like there's too much space, and so they can tend to get in trouble more or make poor decisions if there isn't a lot of structure in place in those settings. And you may want to even create a visual schedule, like we had talked about, having either an agenda posted or having a visual schedule. I even think about at our camp, when we have family camps or day camps, we always post what kids are going to be eating, because we often get questions about that. Again, they've maybe gone without food for a time in their life, and so they're curious to know, am I going to have things to eat? Am I, going to be taken care of? Are my physical needs going to be met? So we always try to make that really predictable and post it up. If there's going to be a change in the schedule, it's really important to let people know, to let kids know, so that they can emotionally prepare for that transition, and to try to, give them plenty of time. Just like we were talking before we started this afternoon, and I think Laura was mentioning that they had already decided the big event that usually happens in January, they're going to cancel this year, and going ahead and telling families about that, so that it's not this, kind of anxious, ambiguous place to live in, not knowing. So I think that's good that kids can know that and prepare for that and be ready for that disappointment. And also knowing that transitions can be really hard. So as you're moving from one activity to the next, coming up with things that maybe incorporate music and movement, so that kids can help their bodies feel more calm as they're transitioning to different activities. Or maybe there's a chant that you can do or a song that you can sing that helps them be more ready for that transition. Also knowing that fun events, like we were just mentioning, the big conference in January, or other things like going on outings together, although they can be really exciting, it can also be a little bit overwhelming. Some of our kids feel super overwhelmed by emotions and then end up having trouble calming down from that. And so they just keep kind of ramping up and revving up and revving up. And so they may need help, or they may have trouble and feel really uncomfortable with all the happiness that comes along with it, and may end up making poor decisions. So just being ready for that, and again, knowing the child and working with them to create a plan. So even in the face of change, as much as you can, provide that predictability, consistency, and repetition to increase that child's sense of felt safety. One more thing that I did want to mention is sleeping. If you all ever do overnight events, that may be challenging for kids because they're in a new place, and often new means novel, but to the traumatized brain, it means threat. And so if you're going to be in a place that's new where you're sleeping overnight, also talking to parents and getting an idea of what might be calming and what might be helpful, so that the child can be ready for bed, and maybe collaborating with the family to find out what you can do to help them fall asleep, especially if they have trouble with that. Another part of the 6 R's is to be relational. For children who have been traumatized by physical or sexual or emotional abuse, that idea of emotional intimacy can be really uncomfortable sometimes. And, it can be because it's associated, maybe that idea of people being physically or emotionally close to you might be connected to pain, fear, abandonment, things like that. So just being aware that as you're wanting to build that relationship with them, they may have up some walls, and it's nothing against you. It's just their own struggle because other people have hurt them when they've been close to others in the past. Also knowing that providing a hug or some sort of physical comfort, like holding hands, can be really comforting to some children, but to other children, that can also register as threat in their brain. So maybe you as the teacher are coming up to them to offer some support by placing your hand on their shoulder, but to them, they might not have been expecting it. And so they may quickly move up that arousal continuum and just feel really, really upset by it because they weren't expecting to be touched. So again, just knowing the child and knowing what works best for them. Other kids, will come up to you and want you to hold their hands or want a tight squeeze that helps them feel safer. So the other thing to think about is to avoid harsh punishment. With our kids, a lot of times, maybe they've been in confusing situations in the past, or they've been in situations where very, very harsh punishment was used. And often, rather than teaching them, that's usually the goal that adults have, is they're like, I just want them to not do that anymore. I want them to learn from it. But if it's too harsh, then they will usually feel afraid, and their top part of their brain won't be online so that they can learn the lesson. So as much as you can, being patient and using modeling and that sort of teaching approach. So if there's a certain way that you want the child to behave, modeling that for them, but then also giving them chances to do that. So, sometimes we'll do redos, especially I have, a toddler, and I'm already trying to teach those redos. So very young kids can learn how to do that. You can, ask them to try it again. Let's try that again. Let's show kindness to our neighbor. And you can connect that to a lesson as well about how we can treat others with kindness. All right. Also, just being aware around the nurturing and the affection, not like forcing kids to give adults hugs or, physical affection, letting them be in control of their bodies. And if that's something that they're uncomfortable with, letting them say, hey, I don't feel comfortable with that yet, and being tuned into them about that. And, protecting them to, like, if there's something that you're noticing is just off, or if they're getting upset, stepping in and not pushing them to continue whatever activity it is that they're doing. So thinking about being relational and respectful. Because of your role in the church, you are probably going to be faced with having a lot of difficult conversations with families and with children. I worked in youth ministry for several years. I worked at a pretty big youth camp through the Georgia Baptist Convention for a couple of years. And then also in my local church, I worked with the youth, especially the middle schoolers, and that was fun. But, in those situations, you're likely going to be faced with hard and difficult situations and times when children are confiding in you or families are coming to you, like we had mentioned before. So it's always important to remember to be honest and open, curious and supportive in those situations. Maybe you have some ideas or some opinions, but it's really important to just be supportive in those situations, because maybe you're one of the first people that individual has told about the hard thing they're bringing up. And, if that's met with some judgment or, some moral, saying, well, you shouldn't have done that, then they may end up closing down and not feeling open to talk about that in the future. So I encourage you to talk openly about hard things rather than shutting that down. And that's where, it's important for us to be reflective as adults, that, maybe there are things in our past that when people bring up certain topics, it's hard for us to hear, it's hard for us to think about. So just being aware of the topics that you're comfortable with and the topics that you're less comfortable with. And sort of making a plan for that of, if there are things that you just feel really uncomfortable with, knowing who you can bring into that conversation, because kids notice. They pick up on a lot of things and they notice a lot of things. So if you are, your facial expressions, your body language will tell them if you're comfortable, and if you're putting off those vibes that you're not comfortable with what they're saying, then they may think it's not okay to talk about. And again, it may shut them down. It's important to provide that safe base for them. And the more that a child knows about, what's going on in the adult world, the better. I'm not saying like tell them everything or give them all this information. However, as much as you can, explaining things to them and explaining things in appropriate ways. Of course, the conversation about maybe a birth parent who used drugs, or a family member who died by suicide or something, is going to be different in talking with a 5-year-old than it would be in talking with a 15-year-old. But just kind of knowing how to adjust those conversations when you're having them with the child. If you are supporting adoptive families, and I don't know how many of you all know adoptive families or have them in your churches, but we often encounter in our line of work that families maybe who haven't told the child that they're adopted, and the child is getting older and older and older. And so our stance on it, and this is backed by a lot of research too, is just to always be honest and to always be open as much as you can to share those details, because usually kids get really upset and pretty resentful if adults have held that information from them until they're much older. So if that's something you face, we encourage parents to be honest and to not be harsh in the way that they talk about that child's birth family, because that child came from their birth family, and they may start to believe that they're bad if people are always saying that their birth family is bad. Don't feel like you have to have all the answers to the questions that they ask. As adults, we don't always have the answers. So being honest with them and saying, I don't know, but I'll do my best to find you an answer. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just this idea that as kids are coming to you with these hard and difficult things that they're wrestling with, I think about that idea of, in the Jewish world, sitting Shiva, or in the Anglican world, which is where I was for a few years, holding vigil. And I think that's true for the Episcopal Church. I don't know what words or terms you use in the Methodist world, but just that idea of like holding vigil, being with that person, being present with them, and not rushing them to be okay, kind of like the quote that Shanae read through. When we're in that place, we just sometimes need to just wrestle and grieve and be in that hard place for a bit before we're ready to move forward. And so I love this quote, not perfect, but present. Tina Payne Bryson, she was the author of The Power of Showing Up. It's not necessarily about following the right program or having the perfect formation curriculum for your faith. I mean, those are important things for sure. But I think people remember how they felt when they were with you. And if you were, a safe person for them, emotionally safe. So it's about being fully present. And that's, I was thinking about it. That's what Christ did. He met people where they were, even in the midst of their hard, and even in the midst of their sin, he met them there. So we want to create an environment that is where we are present with them, fully present, not distracted, and where it's predictable and patterned. parallel and positive experiences. So I'm going to try to show another quick video on empathy. And I'm curious if any of you all have seen this video by Brené Brown on empathy. It's pretty popular. I will probably have to do a new screen share, so give me just a moment to do that.
At Aspen Dental, smile for zero money down with zero worries. Plus pay zero interest if paid in full within 18 months.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. Thanks for your patience as I swap screens back and forth. So I'm curious to hear, can you think about opportunities in your programming where you might be able to kind of do some of these things that we've been talking about, either show empathy or be more relational? Yeah, someone mentioned about being adopted and being thankful that parents talked to them about being adopted. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that comment. I appreciate it. We'll keep going here. Additional things that we can think about as we're working with kids from hard places is that they experiences be rewarding and enjoyable, that that they are things that the child enjoys doing. So maybe if you're doing a Bible lesson, incorporating something fun along with that, which a lot of teachers naturally do, but just making sure that it's enjoyable and that interactions with adults are fun and rewarding. A lot of times if a kid is often impulsive or making bad decisions, they can tend to just get in trouble a lot and adults can tend to use a very frustrated tone of voice with them. So trying as best you can to sidestep those frustrating interactions where you feel really impatient and just be playful. That often will cause kids to feel more willing to follow the instructions you've given them, rather than sort of putting their foot down and not doing what you've asked. We also want to be respectful and relevant. We want to adjust our expectations to what the child can do. So we may have kids who are in middle school age, but we see that developmentally they're not quite acting like middle schoolers. Maybe they're acting more like elementary students or toddlers at points whenever they're really, really stressed. And it's because of how your brain is set up. When you're extremely stressed, your ability to access those higher parts of your brain is more difficult. So just realizing that often it has to do with development and functioning, and not necessarily that they're being willful. And it's very confusing to teachers and parents, to say, gosh, Sally can do these things sometimes, but not these other times. And so I don't understand, but that's true for people from hard places with trauma histories. Try to be patient with a child's progress or lack thereof, as much as you can, and with yourself, because as a person who's helping, or even who's parenting, it can be so frustrating, and then you can have a lot of guilt because of how you handled something. But again, trying to be patient with yourself and also with those children. So try to provide that patient, persistent, parallel support. Don't give up on them, to build that sense of felt safety and trust. I love this idea by Stuart Avalon. He says so often, kids do well if they can. It's a lack of skill, not will. And he is actually an adopted child himself who spent quite a bit of time in the child welfare system. And so he knows firsthand that how hard and challenging it can be. So, we might be feeling like kids take 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. But again, it may just be that they need scaffolding. They need your help in learning and acquiring a new skill and practicing it. It may not be that they're they woke up that day with a plan to totally ruin your Wednesday night class or your Sunday morning class. They may just be struggling. It's often the case. And I know too that as a youth leader that I would often, hear diagnoses, and either the child would have a reputation before they came to the gathering, or the parent would come and say, gosh, I don't know what to do. My child just received this diagnosis. Now what? So a lot of our kids with trauma backgrounds have multiple diagnoses, and, it can be hard to really know what's right or what's correct. And often it's just a way that people are kind of saying what symptoms they're seeing, but they're not really understanding what's truly there, which is complex developmental trauma in most of our kids. I even, I had a family that I was working with, and the child did a 1-hour telemed session with a new provider they'd never met before. And I don't know how much this provider knew about his history, but he had experienced significant abuse in his past, lots of different types of abuse. And after that 1-hour session, he was diagnosed with ODD, and then a case manager who was talking with the mom was saying, hey, I don't understand, ODD, what is that? Will you explain it to me? And the guy responded with, oh, it's that thing that the kid who shot up Columbine had. It's like that, where they go, shoot up a school. And oh my goodness, I can't imagine how that mom felt in that moment of, what? I have this kid in my house who could do that, who has the capacity to do that with this diagnosis. Thankfully, I've had a relationship with a family and I knew the kid well enough to say, hey, this is not that kind of a kid. So people may be very confused or have, sort of an approach that's incorrect whenever they're trying to be helpful. So I would just say, as much as you can, stay calm and be supportive to the family, and refer them to professionals who can really help and who truly understand. And then I like this. I can't remember if you all have seen this before, but this is Dr. Perry's brain. It's his kind of picture of the brain. This is clearly not an actual brain, but it gives us an idea of what different parts of the brain do. So of course we have the lower area, which is the brainstem, in charge of things like heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, regulation. Then the next area up, that yellow part, is in charge of appetite, sleep, arousal, which is being kind of like, revved up or being too tired. Then we have that limbic area that's all about, attachment and relationships and emotions. And then that top cortex area, which is important for abstract thinking, reflection, understanding good morals and values, and following through on those things. And so I show you this to say, the strength of the brain is wired for survival. So for a lot of people from hard places, that lower part of the brain is very, very strong because it's had to be in order for them to survive to this point. And because it's so disorganized and dysregulated in that lower part, the upper part's not very well regulated and can't, come in and say, hey, calm down. So a lot of times whenever people are referred to local providers very often use what we call cognitive behavior therapy. And it really depends on that top part of the brain to be very strong, to be able to calm down the lower part of the brain that's kind of upset and dysregulated. Unfortunately for kids from hard places, they're, the top part of their brain, it's not strong enough to do that, to calm the upset lower part of the brain down. And so it can be really ineffective to just do talk therapy, to just talk it out, or for a kid to just have lots of lectures from parents and caregivers or church, youth leaders or things like that. So those long lectures on immorality, you may want to set those aside for, kids with these types of situations. Many of our kids need body-based somatosensory interventions to help their bodies calm down. And then usually when their bodies feel calm, their brains will follow. And until those lower parts of the brain have been able to settle and reorganize, it's going to be hard for them to be good at relationships and noticing the needs of other people. So when the brain is feeling threatened, it gets worse at thinking and making choices. If you want students to think better, help them feel safe. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about, as you're referring families, I know this is focused on clinical and community resources, so as you're referring families to these resources, here are some things to find out from those providers. These are the types of therapy that you want to look for in a provider. Rather than just having cognitive behavior therapy, I would say look for things like this, like SMART, TheraPlay, trust-based relational intervention, which is was developed by Karen Purvis, the lady that you saw in the video, the first lady. Attachment regulation and competency, which we call ARC. EMDR is really, really effective and really helpful for a lot of people with trauma histories. The circle of security, doing play therapy, and parent-child interactive therapy called PCIT. It can be helpful, but it needs to be modified for kids who have had disruptions in their attachment. So if they are not with their birth family, then they need to have a modification. Additional things to look for in that can be just helpful just to know about are things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech, other things including neurofeedback, integrative health where they're checking hormones and neurotransmitters to see if they're working properly and at the right levels, and also understanding nutrition. A lot of our kids, it's amazing what sugar does to their bodies, and when parents take them off sugar or off gluten, they see a huge change and improvement. So those are just some additional therapeutic supports just to know about. And when you're referring a family to a counseling therapist, and often I have, because I have a lot of people in my circle who, ask me, okay, who should we go to? We want to see a Christian counselor. And I just wanted to educate you that there are a lot of Christian counselors out there, but maybe they're not all the same. Or there are a lot of providers out there that aren't all the same, don't have the same approach when it comes to spirituality. So these are just like three basic. There are more than this. There are at least 5 different kind of views, but I've tried to narrow it down for you. So on one end, you have the basic psychology approach where they're only looking at mental health, and it's all based in science and understanding the self. And then you have this sort of integrated view where this provider is trained in, psychology, but also has a Christian perspective, and they're trained to integrate that. And there are programs that do that. I attended one, and so they're very good at integrating those two. So you get the best of kind of both worlds. And then you have this biblical counseling side of things where typically the provider is only interested in a biblical perspective and usually doesn't want to consider scientific data or, kind of secular, I guess you would call it, methods of helping people. So there are different types of providers that people will encounter when they're looking for help and support. I'm gonna pass it over to Shanae to look at the therapeutic web.
Yes, thank you, Kendall. So as we're thinking about ways that you in the church, whatever your program might look like, how you can connect your families and the people you serve in the community, one of the concepts that's really important to understand is the idea of building a therapeutic web around someone who is struggling, whether that's a child dealing with a trauma history or some other thing that's going on within a family. So we want to build as many supports around them as we can to really give them lots of positive, healthy relationships and perspectives and good connections in their community. And so there's lots of different ways to do this. But thinking about, is this child connected to, some sort of sport where they feel successful and connected and do well? Yoga can be a very powerful practice for a lot of people who've dealt with trauma. You want to make sure it's a trauma-informed sort of a yoga experience, if that's the route they're going to go. But talking about body-based therapies, yoga is really helpful in helping us connect our mind and body, learn to feel safe and calm in our body, and feel in control. Dance and gymnastics can be very helpful for these same sorts of things. Getting children connected with music. We know that rhythm is very soothing and regulating for the brain. Often churches have choirs and other musical opportunities. And so how can you connect children in those avenues? Looking at things like arts and crafts, being creative and expressive is very powerful. And then even exercise. So thinking about ways that churches can do all of this. I've seen churches actually create a gym in their facility and allow people to come and use that space. Or my church has hosted yoga classes that were very much focused on breathing and being calm and really connecting to your body. Utilizing the music programs that your church already has in creative ways to connect and engage with children, all sorts of different things. So the church is really uniquely positioned to do a lot of this building of the therapeutic web, just with the sorts of things that are already there, and also with connections to the community. And to further this, looking at other ways to make sure children are connected. How are they tied in your faith community? Do they just show up for an hour once a week, or are you building a real relationship with them where they feel safe and supported there? One thing that can be incredibly powerful and that I think churches could do a lot of too is mentor programs. So a child who has a mentor, an adult who is there just to take care of them and notice them and check in with them, can be really powerful in building trust and in starting to feel like adults are safe. And a lot of churches have really unique ways to do that. I know in my church, we created sort of mentor program during our mission trips. They're week-long trips, and an adult is matched with a teen and they write them notes throughout the week, and then they meet during some regular times throughout the year. And a lot of those relationships, especially with my kids who really crave connection, have been really powerful and really long-lasting. And some of the kids who've grown up are now wanting to do that for younger kids as they're entering college and adulthood. So finding ways to build mentoring opportunities into your church. How can you connect with local school counselors and see what sorts of needs they have with their students, thinking about things like mentoring and other resources? How can you connect with neighbors, with various after-school programs? I think after-school and summer camp programs are very powerful, and they're often also the place where you find the most traumatized children, in my experience. And often the staff in those programs are college age, young adults, and maybe don't have a lot of understanding of some of the things we've been talking about during these trainings. So how can you make sure that your younger staff are really aware of how to meet children's needs in the programs that they're providing, so that those places can be part of a therapeutic web and not just somewhere that that child is going where they're constantly getting in trouble or getting kicked out, and that kind of thing. And then we want to think about support groups for families. So the parent or caregiver also needs support. Things like recovery groups or Al-Anon, grief groups, divorce groups, groups for adoptive parents. I know my church started hosting our Fuse groups from Harmony, and those are monthly support groups for foster and adoptive parents. And it's been really neat because some of the foster and adoptive families in our church were excited to see that. And so it's starting to bridge that little community even more. And also supports for relative caregivers. So I know my church and lots of places in East Tennessee are seeing grandparents and aunts and uncles, even great-grandparents, raising relatives' children. And they have some unique needs that are a little different than just a typical adoptive family. And so how can you connect with them and make sure that they're getting the supports that they need as well? And this is another quote from Tina Bryson. "What matters is connection and cultivating the kind of presence to slow things down and wake up to what is happening around us." And I think, again, talking about how powerful it is just to show up and to be present, how critical that can be, especially for our children from hard places. And then so something I enjoy doing in my work as a youth leader is really how do we craft policies and procedures that make sure we're taking into account things like mental health needs and supporting all of our children, including the ones with trauma histories. And so like Kendall touched on earlier, keeping programming as regular as you can. And that's really weird right now because most of us are virtual or we're trying to maybe get back in person, but it looks very different. So how can you make sure that the programming you're offering is as regular as it can be and as familiar as it can be? So, you know, if you had certain rituals and routines that you did before the pandemic, how can you incorporate as much of that as possible into what you're doing now, whether that's virtual or some sort of in-person activity? And how can you really consider the children with some of these trauma needs? For example, my church went pretty much all virtual for a good part of the pandemic. I serve a lot of children with autism spectrum disorder. They were not all thrilled to be on video cameras. I had more than one child having meltdowns. And so we had to think about, okay, how can we meet their needs in this? So letting people not have their cameras on, not forcing participation, keeping things as close to what we used to do and as familiar as possible. Giving kids the option to call in on the phone if that felt safer than being on a video camera. Lots of different things like that. And we've actually decided, pandemic permitting, to do alternating every other week in person, very distanced, and then virtual, because so many of our kids are struggling with the social things that come along with virtual. And then we want to consider things like confidentiality, and that can be challenging, especially I think about some of my kids who share very personal things at maybe some of those high school youth retreats or conferences, and they share very personal things. So how can we make sure we honor their disclosures and maintain confidentiality, and encouraging other youth to do that as well? So really building a community that values that. And we also want to have respect and dignity, right? So I know Kendall mentioned earlier talking about children's diagnoses before they even come to your program, right? We've all heard, oh, that little one, he's so hyperactive or he's so defiant. That's not respecting him and respecting his dignity. And so how can we create a culture where we talk about children in ways that build them up and focus on their strengths, while still acknowledging their struggles and their challenges, but maybe not sort of focusing first on those. We want to think about what we do with disclosures, in particular, some of the hard things that children may disclose. How do we navigate that? I know for myself, we do a lot of events across East Tennessee with other youth programs, big camps and things. And we kind of have a policy amongst all of the youth ministers that if anybody's child, whether it's ours or not, discloses something and we become aware of it, that we give them one day to go home to their personal youth leader and tell them about the thing. Or that youth leader will then reach out and say, hey, your kid disclosed this, what do we need to do? So giving them a little bit of respect and a little bit of time to say, hey, that's a really big thing. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I'm going to give you until Sunday afternoon to let Shanae know about this issue that's going on in your world. And I'll check in with her Sunday afternoon. And if you haven't had a chance to tell her yet, I will be letting her know what's going on. And so we found that really helpful, especially again at those big events where maybe not every youth leader is present, or kids are sharing with someone who they might have a different kind of a relationship with. So really thinking about how you navigate that. And then whenever a child discloses, we always want to make sure we're telling the parent as well. So just because they tell you, it doesn't need to be just ending with you. And so that especially comes, I have a lot of children who disclose things like cutting and self-harm or depression, those sorts of things. And so I typically do the same thing the youth leaders do. I'll set a time with that child and say, okay, you have until Monday night. This usually comes out on a Sunday, so you have till Monday night to let your mom or your dad know. And then I'm going to be giving them a phone call. And so hopefully you'll have been able to tell them by then, but if not, that's when I'm going to let them know what's going on. And of course, if it's something very serious, we might need to deal with it immediately. But if it's something that's a little less critical, giving them that chance to really handle it themselves and share that personal information with their family. And I found that's really empowering for a lot of the kids too, that I'm not running to just rat them out the minute I find something out, but that they get the chance first. And then, of course, in the world of teenagers and even the adults you work with, we sometimes have, big crises come up. So suicide can certainly be something that makes us all a little uneasy. But it's important to know what your resources are. And something I do with my youth, because they're stuck with a therapist as a youth minister, is we do regular mental health days where we learn about different mental health issues. We talk about resources. We talk about how they can support their friends if they're dealing with these sorts of things. And then I always equip them with phone numbers like these. So suicide hotlines, texting hotlines, ways that they can be empowered as well to really support themselves and their friends if this comes up, so that it's not just a big scary thing they've never thought of before, but they feel empowered to know what to do. And then also making sure all the adults in your programs know these resources as well and are comfortable. So thinking about suicide and having resources around that. We also want to think about other crisis resources too. So in my work with children and teenagers, mobile crisis can be very helpful. They will, at least in East Tennessee, they will send out a therapist or evaluate you over the phone to see if someone needs maybe further psychiatric care. And I have certainly used mobile crisis with several families that I serve at my church. And so just being comfortable with what that process looks like and the phone number, having that ready to give them can be very helpful. Thinking about domestic violence resources in your community, your local sexual assault center. Unfortunately, I think with teenagers, that's one that we probably need to be ready for and have those conversations, because that is definitely something that comes up. And also your local pregnancy support options. That can also be something that's needed. So just having that, empowering your youth workers, your volunteers, everyone in your ministry programs to know what to do if those issues come up and know who to turn to can be so helpful, so that they're able to stay calm and present when they're talking with that individual, and not just be frantically thinking, oh my goodness, who do I tell or what do I do with this?
We did have one question come through, and so I didn't know if we wanted to address it now or wait till the end when we have a time for Q&A.
Let's see. When you want a child to tell their parents, do you ask or try to find out? Yes. So I think that is a really good question, especially depending on what the issue might be, right? And so I definitely have some pretty in-depth conversations with children when they're sharing anything. And for the most part, I find my kiddos are just uncomfortable because they're afraid their parents will be disappointed with them. But certainly there can be parents who are not going to be supportive or who could even be harmful. And so having that conversation is important, because there may be, some other considerations. Maybe that conversation needs to happen when the child's in a neutral place or a safe place. Maybe it's something you need to address at the church as a sort of a group, or maybe their school would be a better place to kind of handle that. And you could reach out to the school counselor to say, hey, this is something. So I think that's a really good point, is sometimes parents are not going to be supportive of things children and teens disclose. And we do want to make sure that they're safe. And that is something that I always ask is, what do you think your parents will say when they hear this? And then we can kind of walk through the various options. And I'm fortunate in my program to know all of my families very closely. I think if you're in a bigger program and you don't, that might be something too to really dig into is this child going to be safe? Is this family going to take this seriously? And is there a better way to do this? Absolutely, that's a good question.
And a participant mentioned even offering to go with that child if they are feeling really nervous or if they're worried about what's going to happen during that conversation.
Yes, and I've definitely had a few of those conversations, in the church office when we're kind of on neutral territory and maybe people are going to be a little more calm than they would be, at home. Absolutely. And I know you all do safe sanctuaries trainings. And so just to keep in mind too, as we're talking about children from hard places, when there's disclosures of abuse and neglect, whether it's in the past or whether it's something that's happening currently, being familiar with what those things are and what the reporting laws are is very important. So we've got lots of different types of abuse, and just making sure your volunteers are very familiar with what those might look like, getting some good training around those, what to look for can be very important. So you always want to make sure too, if you're in Tennessee, that everyone knows they are a mandated reporter, age 18 and up. And so it is not on a volunteer to come tell the minister who then reports it. It is on that volunteer to report, and they can certainly talk about it and get support in doing that. But making sure everyone knows. Those of you who might not be in Tennessee, I am not so sure what your rules are, but making sure you're familiar with that. And then, of course, if you ever had a true emergency or felt like it was something that needed to be dealt with immediately, you can always call 911 as well. And so there are tons of different trauma-informed resources available. One of the things that I've done with my church, we had a library. I think a lot of churches have libraries that maybe are kind of outdated and no one's really been using them for a while. And so we really tried to create a smaller, more condensed library that had a lot of resources for parents and for teens and for children. And a lot of it is this sort of trauma-informed or mental health awareness kind of stuff, so that people can access that in your building. Or if you're talking with someone and they say, hey, I'm dealing with this right now, you can say, oh, we've got this book right here and this might be really helpful. And we keep lots of different things in our library, but you could kind of tailor it to what your population seems to need the most. So a few different things. We've referenced Dan Siegel's work throughout this training. So books by him like The Whole Brain Child, No Drama Discipline, Parenting from the Inside Out. I find those are very popular, even with my families who have no trauma history. Just maybe with children who have something like ADHD or families who just are struggling to parent their child. Those are really helpful, easy reads. For families who've got trauma histories going on, The Connected Child is very, very helpful. And then The Body Keeps the Score is a really wonderful, but definitely more dense look at trauma's impact on the brain and body. So we keep lots of different resources in our little library, and it's really been popular with our families, and they feel very comfortable in taking and borrowing those books without even necessarily having to explain why they need them. And then if you all need any support from Harmony for the families you serve, we do a couple of different things. Across the state of Tennessee, we do free in-home family therapy for children adopted through the child welfare system. We can also serve private and international adoptees on more of a sliding scale fee. And so that is a wonderful resource, especially for families who are just overwhelmed and don't have time to drive to another appointment. We're able to come in home and serve them. And they can self-refer or they can be referred by any community member for those services. If you're in the Knoxville area, we also have an outpatient therapy center, and we don't just serve adopted children there. It can be couples and families and individuals as well as children. And so that's more of a private pay or an insurance-based clinic. And that's an option. And then we run family camps for adoptive families, and we also run grand families camps for relative caregivers out of Blount County. So that's a resource if you have families in your parish. And then parent coaching and education. So we have some adoptive families who are very well trained in all of these things, who can support families in dealing with some of the struggles that may come along with parenting children with trauma histories. Allison Douglas from the last training is one of those. And so that's a really great resource as well. And then we offer support groups, fuse groups. Of course, those are virtual right now. Typically they meet in churches. And so that's been something fun that my church has actually been able to host. But those are across the state of Tennessee, typically once a month. And right now they are virtual, so they may be more accessible to people. Those are for foster and adoptive families. And then you can always go on our website and find lots of resources and ideas, especially since the pandemic. We've got lots of things on our Harmony at Home page that are not only helpful for children with trauma histories, but just children who are adjusting to virtual schooling and all of the things that come with that. And then we can always do trainings and education in the community, like we're doing with you all. So if you know of a church or a group or somebody who would benefit from that, please reach out. All right, so we are going to open it up for questions. If anyone has anything you would like to ask or share, we have about 10 minutes for that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Shanae, where would be the best place for folks to start looking for ways to connect in their particular area, to contact Family Harmony Center or look elsewhere, or what?
Yeah, so if they want to go to the website, harmonyfamilycenter.org, there's lots of information there about what we do, and also lots of other information that would probably be very helpful. And for those of you who run any kind of programming with children and youth, one of the things that I did when I took over my position 6 years ago was really look at the TBRI, so trust-based relational intervention model, and look at how can I create a program that really meets these sort of basic needs. So my youth, many of them have trauma histories or some other special needs, probably in part because we do so much to make sure we're supportive and the word gets around. But I used a lot of the videos that are on the TBRI YouTube page to really look at things like making sure we're providing regular healthy snacks and that children have access to water all the time, and those sorts of basic need things that Kendall talked about earlier. I've also completely redone my room to think about things like children not ever having their back to the door so they feel safer, or having chairs and seating that meet a whole lot of different sensory needs, which I'm sure Allison talked about last time. And so I will put that in the chat box. It's trust-based relational intervention. And I just found that to be kind of a really helpful framework. It's also helpful in thinking about discipline and in thinking about things like we connect with children before we correct a behavior. So that is definitely something that was helpful for me. And she has lots of really wonderful videos about those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it was developed by Karen Purvis, which is spelled a little differently. So I put her name in the chat box as well.
She's the one we watched in that first video. Any other questions or thoughts from anybody? I'll share one final thought just from one of the children that I work with who has a very significant trauma history and who was adopted out of foster care. And this young man is just one of my favorite humans. But he had had an experience in another youth group where he showed some of his behaviors that were stress responses. And he was met with a lot of the lecturing and the you need to do better and God is not pleased with you. And then he was kicked out of the youth group. And it took him a while to share it. But what he said to me one day is, you know, if even the church doesn't want me, why would anybody else want to put up with me? And that just really stuck with me about how powerful the ways that churches deal with our most frustrating members is, because he's right. If even the church who's supposed to deal with everybody, you know, gave up on him, which is how it felt to him, why should he care about himself? And so I think about him a lot when I'm doing this work, because we don't want our little people to feel that way. And we definitely don't want our teenagers to feel that way. And so to me, that's part of why this work is so important.
Thanks for sharing that, Shanae. That always brings tears to my eyes to hear you say that. And I wanted to also, I think Keith wanted to mention a training that's coming up that we're offering soon.
Folks, we're going to be offering a training, a couple of trainings, how to talk to your children about suicide. It's something that we've developed for the adoptive families that we work with, but we're also going to be doing a training to help support parents during virtual learning, because it can be a challenge for any child, but especially children who have some of the trauma histories or ADHD or some of the other learning challenges. It's hard to be in front of a screen. You all know how hard it is to sit for an hour and a half now in front of a screen, and some of these kids are being required to do that all day. So Allison Douglas is developing a training just to coach parents on how to think about this. As we say at Harmony, this is good for all kids. This approach, this technique, this knowledge base, and it's absolutely necessary for those kids who have trauma challenges or challenges because of other issues. We at Harmony want to thank you for this opportunity. This is something we've talked about for a long time, of how can we get this information out to as much of the therapeutic web as possible, and especially the faith community, and us all be on the same page with our approach in supporting these families and children. If you think any portion of this training or a combination of these 3 sessions may be helpful for your congregation, for your district events, or those of you who are connected with more conference-wide training and opportunities, we would love to do that, provide that for you. My contact information is on the PDF of this slide deck that will be going out to you, so feel free to contact me directly. We also do this training for schools and community organizations. We train individual schools. We've trained entire school systems. We trained the entire Blount County school system and Maryville City system, and have gone into Knox County and even schools in Middle Tennessee to provide training. So if you're ever connected with those groups and feel like they need some of this support, we're happy to do that as well. To help us improve in what we offer to the faith community and to other communities, we're going to ask you to participate in a survey, and Laura or Susan will be sending that to you later on. And just give us some feedback about what was helpful, any other information that may be helpful to you, other faith communities or other community agencies that you're aware of. So thanks for participating. Susan, Laura, thanks so much for this opportunity and this partnership and providing this information. And if we can ever be a resource to you or any of the families, feel free to reach out to us. That's why we're here at Harmony. So Susan, Laura, back over to you.
All right. Thank you all so very much. We appreciate the training that you have given us over the past 6 weeks, I guess now, and for the tools that we now have in our toolbox. And we appreciate too the opportunity to call on you all in the future. We thank you for your work that you are doing with so many young people and so many families. And we look forward to walking alongside you so that we can have healthier and happier communities. So we appreciate each and every person who has joined us on these calls, and we really appreciate it. Like Susan said, we will be making these available in the next few days, and we'll send out that information as well about where you can access these later. And then the email will be coming shortly with the slides from today's presentation as well as the survey. So thanks again, all of you, for joining us, and we'll be in touch. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.